So yeah, tell us why it's generally easier to infiltrate these urban units as opposed to rural.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I don't necessarily think this is something that is unique to this context on the island of Ireland. I think it could be the case also when we look at different conflicts and paramilitaries elsewhere. I think if we look at urban areas to begin with, so even with the cell structure, the issue for the IRA was in the cities that is more chance. Like I remember someone used to work for the British Security Services used to say that you could have a lot more like nosy neighbours in places like Belfast and Derry. So people who can just be looking out their window or on the street, wandering around, keeping an eye on people. And and anyone would know from any rural area, it'd be the same in parts of like, I don't know, rural Wales. People are suspicious if you like going wandering up to someone's farm to see what they're up to. Like that generally is pretty suspicious. So that made a difference in the cities. It was easy to recruit people in that way. What was interesting as well was that for like surveillance on IRA cells, like Raymond Gilmore makes an interesting point in his work, which was that he didn't specifically say this related to rural areas, but when we talk more about rural areas in a minute, you're dealing with often like friends, family, people that were quite tightly knit in a Republican community in that area. I mean, if you remember, like not so much South Bar because you're almost dealing with almost 90% plus nationalist, and then you'd have a core sizable support of republicanism within that. But in places like Tyrone, obviously, and Fermanagh, you still have quite a sizable unionist minority in those populations. They weren't the majority of the population from partition onwards, but they were a sizable minority. So you've already got, if you like, potential surveillance from that side of things on your units. Then, of course, within the nationalist community, there's going to be SDLP support, which is going to be, meaning that Republicans are drawing from a certain smaller community overall. In the cities, so what I'm saying related to that in rural areas is that most people would know each other of some form and have contact with each other. So that, to an extent, might put some more inhibitions on informing. And the way I'll explain it is this: that it's interesting in contrast, like Raymond Gilmore says in the cities, not just about the nosy neighbor business. He also mentions about, he was quite young at the time when he had infiltrated the IRA and was in one of their units in Derry. And he was mixing with people who were 10 years plus older than him. So he made the point, even just on a surveillance point for the intelligence services about informers, it didn't take that much to work out if a 19-year-old and a 35-year-old who aren't connected, that might well be because they're in the same IRA cell unit. So he said things like that made a difference in the cities. And I think the other thing there is, on the one hand, I can see with the cell structure, you mix people from different areas. In theory, that means they won't know necessarily the ins and outs of every Republican in, I don't know, like West Belfast, if they're from North Belfast or South Belfast, which is true. But Gilmore also gave in his case and other cases kind of verified this, that you might be less inclined to have inhibitions about informing because of the fact that you don't actually know these people and like a kind of day in day out business, so that makes a difference. I think also in cities, a lot of British intelligence security was saying there was and Republicans had this like posters up about the dangers of like what they called loose talk in pubs and clubs. It's not that that didn't exist necessarily in the countryside. It's just that, I mean, partly you had the border, so you could escape across the border, and that's not. I don't think in the countryside, sometimes you get from British security intelligence, oh, the Gardaí elapse, the Irish government doesn't do anything. I don't think it's that so much. I just think it's the fact that they don't have the resources and budget that the UK state had and was throwing at Northern Ireland. So, actually, like Republicans would say, and I've said in interviews, like the Guardian were tough if you got caught in the Republic. They weren't soft at all on cross-border activity, but it's a resources issue. And, the British government struggled to deal with a 300-mile plus border. And they had plenty of resources to throw at it. So the Gardaí with less, and the Irish Army with, much less finance provided to them by the state, they're not going to be able to deal with that kind of level of activity. So that would make a difference. And I think that, in countryside as well, and South Armagh would be a specific example of this, that they seem to have a process in place there. And again, people from various sides of the conflict and British archives, we can see verifying this, of wouldn't say like trialing people out, but ensuring people were committed, not putting them into kind of frontline IRA activity unless they felt they were trusted and they were ready to do so. So what I mean by that is that, like, there's a quote in the book. One Republican mentioned to me that someone on the run went to South Armagh, and South Armagh IRA asked them to watch some helicopters landing. And so the person goes and watches it and then comes back and says, I think the helicopter, from like descent to its landing took about somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds. And they're like, that's not good enough. What is it? Is it 10.1 seconds, 10.2? So there's a level of detail and attention to detail in South Armagh. And the thing is, because you had that attention to detail, it meant less people were getting arrested. If less people are getting arrested, there, and again, most Republicans resist this, but there might be one or two, not specifically in South Armagh, but other areas that might, provide information after interrogation or break under interrogation. But if you're not being interrogated because you're not being arrested, then you kind of partly solve that issue. And what that meant is you had people who were kind of like veteran Republican operators, if you want to call it, in places like that. So that made it more difficult. But I think as well in countryside areas, and it's not like, I'm cautious of this because it's not the case that people in the urban areas like Derry and Belfast are more likely to cross each other up, etc. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think the border factors I talked about would have been key. But the other thing is, if you again take places like South Armagh, but also like Tyrone and Fermanagh, when we talked about them to begin with, all three of those areas were majority nationalist from the time of partition. So I think there was a long-term dormant tension about being pushed into unionist state without consent in the 1920s that would have, again, made people reluctant to pass information and not willing to British security forces, etc. Also, obviously, what happened with civil rights movement discrimination, like it generally was, they said like west of the River Bann, there's a scholar, White, I can't remember his first name, but he said that like the discrimination was much worse left or west of the River Bann in the north. And essentially that's because if you look at like Tyrone, Fermanagh, South Armagh, the nationalist majority areas, so if the unionists wanted to control local politics and councils, they, in their heads, they had to discriminate to make sure they stayed on top. Because if things were leveled out, then that wouldn't happen because there was a majority nationalist population in those areas. Anyway, so what I'm saying is you've got that as a background in some of these rural areas. Plus, then you got British security forces coming in. Internment would have affected some of these areas. Local people interned. Some of them might have worked, as an example, I think in County Tyrone, someone was a school teacher, so they were quite well known in the local community. So that's going to cause anger. And then obviously people would see other events like Bloody Sunday, etc. But there were also local incidents, like there was, I remember top of my head, a guy called Eamon McDavitt, County Tyrone, who was hard of hearing, and he was shot by the security forces. Like, again, that pissed local Republicans off and nationalists. And South Armagh, obviously, because of the checkpoints were set up, and same across the border, creating roads, disrupting local travel. Even if the security forces said, well, we have to do this to disrupt the IRA, it was still massive inconvenience for local people. And you even see, like, some of my chapters in South Armagh, you've got people who support the SDLP. So they're not anti-Sinn Féin and anti the IRA. But say, like, the British security forces, in their view, in places like South Armagh, were going around harassing people, full stop, like whatever their background was. Okay, so why I'm telling you this is because I think this makes a big difference to also why you're not getting that level of like infiltration in places like South Armagh, because people who might have been against the IRA there certainly were not going to pass information generally to the security forces because they was disrupting and harassing their everyday life. And like a classic example of that, a guy called Fergal Caraher, who was a Republican, was shot dead. I think it was in 1990, top of my head, in South Armagh. And essentially, the British Army units involved say, well, we asked them to stop at a checkpoint. They drove their car straight at us, so we shot him. Republicans disputed that and said he was summarily executed. What's really interesting is in William Matchett's book, he quotes an IUC personnel saying there that when any security force member was killed in South Armagh, pretty much no one came forward to give information. And he said when Carragher is killed, loads of people are coming forward, including people who aren't Republicans. So the reason I'm giving that as a context, again, it's because it gives us a sense of like why people in these areas were not going to pass information. And that's partly because of the behavior at times of the security forces isolated them from people. You'd have that to an extent in Belfast and Derry as well, but there are obvious factors at Belfast. So you don't have the border option in terms of escaping after attacks. And also, you know, in the cities, we should say as well, like, again, which you pointed out at the beginning, it's not just your informers, you've got your helicopters up, you've got your CCTV. And once you remove the barricaded areas, it's difficult for the IRA to operate and move around in those city city locations. So yeah, so there is some difference between the two, and I think that and then, you know, like factors in the countryside, as we said as well, like the landscape and the fact that if you got your nosy neighbors, how are they going to provide information like without being caught out? It'd be so obvious in a rural area to do that. And even the fact, like, again, I'll give you one more example in South Armagh. Raymond McCreesh, who died on hunger strike, I seem to remember, I hope I got that right. And again, it's interesting, in one SDLP person's memoirs, they say that this was like the local community in South Armagh saw that as like a tragedy. You know, that's not something that was unique to Republicans. And I think I seem to remember they said, you know, he was doing when he was younger, like a paper round or a milk round, something like that. So local people from Nash's community knew him. And I think that is, you know, that must have a difference in terms of what's happening with the infiltration, because you've got links and bonds to people. You might disagree with their political perspective, but you're from the same community background. You've both had the same experience, like the civil rights things, nationalists and Republicans from places like South Armagh terrain. So I do think that makes a difference. In terms of infiltration.
Actually, on the note of South Armagh, this I read in the book, and it seemed so obvious after I read it, but I hadn't thought of it before. Was the fact that obviously it got to the stage where they couldn't patrol the roads at all because it was so dangerous. And if you can't patrol the roads, then you can't make the initial contact with someone who might become an informant, like the initial hello, and then you're okay. That person in that house is a bit friendly. We can possibly work them into. If you can't patrol the roads, you just can't make that contact at all. Like.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and again, William Matchett's book, obviously we have a different opinion overall about the conflict, but what is interesting in William Matchett's book, you know, he says that about South Armagh. He said the reason the IRA were partly so powerful there is because the IUC couldn't do its, you know, everyday policing. And part of that is asking, you know, knocking on doors, asking if people had seen things, etc. Now, in fairness, that wouldn't be different to West Belfast and again, like the Bogside, etc. That is similar. But the difference is, you know, there's enough other people in those city areas who didn't support the IRA and Sinn Féin that you can get information from those people. But in South Armagh, because you're dealing with essentially a hostile population to the British security forces, and in my view, because of things the British security forces have done or not done in terms of the government and civil rights and its approach to that in the 60s into the early 70s. Yeah, that made a difference. So I think that's key. Yeah, I do think that's key.
I was going to say another thing about the border and being able to flee over it and avoid arrest is you don't need to, they didn't need to like replenish the ranks quite as much as some of the urban guys did. And then that has this knock-on effect that you have more experienced guys there and they can kind of mentor the younger guys and build it up. It's almost like it's something that would apply to like any management structure, like be it, you know, guerrilla thing or not.
Yeah. And I think that it's an interesting question because like the IRA operating in England had this debate at various times that if you have people who are experienced in South Armagh, again, it goes back to that thing about not being able to patrol the roads, etc., on foot. Vehicle patrols because of roadside bombs, basically from the early 70s. So you can do it on foot, but you need significant support and be helicoptered in and out, etc. But the important thing there, as you said, is that in South Armagh, because you have the experienced operators and to an extent the IRA control the ground, if you like, that it's going to be very, very difficult to get infiltration in that way. And also it meant, you know, you have a danger, as various Republicans said to me about when you have experienced operators. On the one hand, and this particularly applied for operating in England, they have expertise, so they're probably more likely to do what needs to be done in terms of an operation and potentially get away with it. The problem is, outside a place like South Armagh, if they've already been in prison or interned, they're probably already known. Well, they are already known, and they're probably under surveillance. But the issue is, of course, you bring in sometimes like Jerry Bradley in his book about the IRA referred to these people as like green lights, people who have not been picked up by intelligence services or intelligence services, security forces before, and then like arrested, interned, or imprisoned. They don't have that record, but then do they have the expertise to like carry out attacks successfully and get away with it, and in a way that doesn't necessarily endanger themselves, etc. And again, in places like not just in the north, like Belfast, etc., but also in when they were operating in England, that was a bit of a thing that the Republicans had to weigh up in terms of being able to carry out their attacks, etc. Yeah.